As the northern lights fill the sky, Weyland is hard at work, ripping apart the landscape, extracting every resource. Midnight Sun's op carves the Siberian steppe. And as the vast expanses are quickly eaten up, leaving nothing behind, Weyland may need to resort to some more direct tactics. Kimberlite Field. At all hours, the speedogores rumble across the open tundra, churning, unending. But what are they even digging for? Hostile architecture. Property protection comes easy with friends like these. You'll stay out and you'll be happy, or you'll get hurt, trust me. End of the line. Leaving scorched earth in their wake, some old habits die hard. Goodbye, Sundog. Even this far north, the permafrost burns. And finally, ZATO City Grid. Marked on no maps, Weyland's secret cities will remain that way. The ice is built different up here. Tread carefully. These are 4 upcoming cards from Null Signal Games' Parhelion, the second half of the Borealis cycle. I front-loaded these images for those who wanted to quickly check them out, but do stay tuned as we dive into what we think we can do with these new Weyland cards. Hello and welcome back to the Metropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. As you saw there at the top of the video, we have 4 new exciting Weyland cards from Parhelion to talk about today. Huge shoutouts to the folks at Null Signal Games who are kind enough to give us these 4 spoilers that we can reveal here exclusively on this channel. Huge thanks for that. So we have 4 very exciting Weyland cards. What we're going to do now in this part of the video is we're going to go and take the time to talk about each card one by one, to talk a bit about the lore and the flavor behind them, but also what these cards do and what sort of decks and archetypes we can build around them. We'll be talking about both formats, standard and startup, so hopefully there is something here for everyone. And there are timestamps in the YouTube description bar below, so if there's a certain card you want to hear about, feel free to jump ahead. Also, if you like this sort of content, liking this video and subscribing to the channel greatly helps us grow. Without further ado, let's jump in. And our first card we have today is called Kimberlite Field. This is a 4/2 Weyland agenda. It's of the expansion subtype, which I don't think has any relevance to date. It says when you score this agenda, you may trash one of your rezzed cards. If you do, trash 1 installed runner card with a printed install cost equal to or less than the printed res cost of the corp card you just trashed. There's some flavor text from Captain Padma Isbister from Midnight Sun. It says Weyland's synthetic diamonds cost less than naturals. So what are they really digging for here? The flavor for this card is actually pretty haunting and opens up some pretty big questions. But the word Kimberlite itself, that's actually a real thing. Kimberlite's a mineral. It's the sort of thing that you find diamonds in. So it's an igneous rock, a rare variant of peridotite. It's the host matrix for diamonds. It's this green rock on the right. It's the thing that you mine and you find diamonds within. It's named after the town of Kimberley in South Africa, which at the end of the 19th century, it was discovered a giant diamond called the Star of South Africa. And that actually spawned a big diamond rush in South Africa. So this stuff is real. And as Padma points out in the flavor text, well, if Weyland can build synthetic diamonds cheaper than, strip mining wherever they are in the north, what are they actually digging for? And while I don't have the answers to that, I'm going to definitely be paying attention to the flavor text, the lore, and the articles that are coming around in the next a little bit alongside Parhelion, because it's a really kind of haunting question, and I hope we get an answer sometime soon. Now, this agenda reminds probably everyone about another Weyland agenda that just came out in Midnight Sun just a couple months ago, and that's ZATO protocol. It kind of asks a corporation the same question. And maybe not actually a question here. You have to trash something with ZATO protocol, but you do have to destroy your own board state to get a benefit. ZATO protocol requires a trash, and that's actually a pretty significant difference between this card and Kimberlite Field. All the conditions on Kimberlite Field are optional. It's a may ability, so you can just score out a blank 4/2 if you are, for some reason, excited about that. Maybe you have no rezzed cards. But ZATO protocol forces you to trash a card to do 2 meat damage. I would argue that while ZATO protocol does see a lot of play, just about a blank 3/2 will see play in some corporation decks. The ability on Kimberlite Field can have a bigger impact on any board state, albeit it's obviously a bit harder to score out. And these sort of cards, and just about every card we have today, is a very interesting card because the value of the card changes wildly based on whether you want to play it within OP, the new Midnight Sun Weyland Corporation, or outside of OP. And the cool thing about cards like ZATO protocol and also with Kimberlite Field is I think there's reasons to play them out and inside of OP. I think inside OP, obviously, they get a lot more powerful. The ability on OP, it says the first time or at least once per turn when you trash one of your rezzed cards, you can go get a card of cost 1 less than that. So the idea is with Kimberlite Field, of course, once you trash one of your rezzed, say, pieces of ice, you trash something on the opponent's side of the table, and then you just get another card from your deck. That's a very powerful effect. If you've been playing Op, I've been playing a lot of Op and I've been enjoying it immensely. But the idea here very obviously is that it reduces the cost of scoring this agenda out. You no longer lose a card on the table, you just get a different one. And sometimes lowering the res cost by 1 actually isn't the biggest deal. A lot of times you're going to find something that's better suited for this board state. If they have a barrier breaker, or say that you just trashed their decoder, now you can go get a code gate. All right, so we talked about trashing icebreakers, and that gives us to the next big question. What are we trashing with this? And I do think programs are probably the most obvious and maybe one of the most impactful things that we can destroy. So the idea is that you have a 4-cost dice on the table, mouseless, classic. And once you score this thing out, you trash the mouseless, reach across the table, and you trash a 4-cost anything, 4 or less. And that's actually a nuance between Kimberlite and Op. You might be used to playing Op, and Op always says trash something, do something 1 less than that. But Kimberlite, you can hit even. 4 for 4 works. Or say you have something like an Enigma, and I think 4 to 3 is actually a really important breakpoint. A lot of the programs that see play in the game right now generally cost 4 to 3, so it trash an Enigma that maybe doesn't scale well into the mid-late game, and you can trash a program. The idea is if you're sitting across from a criminal, a lot of criminal decks don't run a lot of redundancy with their programs. They're running only 1 Begalter in their deck, and while they do have access to things like Boomerang and Inside Job, maybe an Amakua as an AI breaker, if you can trash their 1 of Killer, it's going to have a huge impact on how they can interact with Ice for the rest of the game. Now, against the rest of the factions, at least in the standard card pool, it gets a bit less consistent. While you can trash maybe a Hyperbaric that's fully loaded, that feels really good. A lot of the Shaper decks are running things like Simulchip, so while their programs can come back, it does come at a real cost. Top of that, against Anarchs, that's a bit harder, specifically in the standard format, where they run things like Paperclip, Black Orchestra, and MK Ultra, icebreakers that come back from the heap. So trashing these doesn't really pay off that well. But that's okay, because you can trash anything. I think icebreakers are really important in certain matchups, but there's a huge flexibility on Kimberlite where you can trash other pieces. Say across the table, and I think this is going to be a really big card in the rotation with Startup that shows up alongside the release of Parhelion, you can trash a Twinning at 3. That's actually pretty easy to trash. Maybe taking down a Stargate in standard is going to be quite important. If you can't hit the Anarch's breakers, at least hit their multi-axis. That's awesome. And some of the cheaper stuff, like the resources, play this kind of like an above the law with additional steps, but taking down an Aesop's pawn shop, 1 cost means just about everything you'll have takes this down. It's going to be really important. There's some other fun, interesting cards, like taking down a Marrow against somebody taking a lot of core damage. That actually can get them maybe to negative hand size, which is lethal at the end of their turn if they can't fix that problem. Now, if you look at certain decks, you realize that a lot of the install costs on the cards in the deck actually do plateau. This is Landlubber, the deck that just came in and did really quite well at the UK Nationals. And if you look at installables, there is no card in this deck that costs more than 4 credits, I'm not mistaken. So just about anything can come down if you trash basically any ice in your deck. You'll be able to trash breakers. And you notice again, with the criminals, there's not a lot of redundancy. Whether people are going to have to change how they build their decks going into a meta that could be playing Kimberlite Field, we'll see. It's potentially quite a very disruptive effect. Now, of course, the elephant in the room. Can you ever sink a ship with a Kimberlite Field? And if you look at the cards, it's technically possible, but it's prohibitively expensive. There are some ice you could be playing. If you want to look at the Weyland stuff, because it is a Weyland agenda, Bulwark on 10 kind of makes sense, and you can maybe play a Tithonium. I think you also have, Pharos is a bit too low, right? Now, trashing a 10 cost ice is incredibly expensive. Ideally, you're playing Op, and if you're doing that, you can go and get a, like a 7 cost ice from your deck. And there's some options, whether you want to play blockchain or not, maybe at the Pharos. You could potentially do it. I don't think it's the best, and it's a very hard or very expensive use of this card, but I do think people are going to pursue that because it's a fun condition. If you look at Startup, the ice is, there's not a lot of ice. So if you're trying to sink an endurance in Startup, you're going to have to work pretty hard. But it's not the big ice that I think is really exciting with this. Even just the smallest ice, like an ice wall. And we'll talk about how Ice Wall is actually pretty compelling with some of the other cards we're going to be talking about today. Just trashing an Ice Wall, a card that doesn't scale at all into the late game, and then trashing something like a Paladin Puemo or an Aesop's Pawn Shop, that's definitely good enough. And if you're playing Op, you can then go ahead and get a Spin Doctor for free from your deck, or Rashida Yahim, and that is absolutely phenomenal. I do think that there's a lot of use cases for this card, and just translating anything into value and then at the same time disrupting the board is a powerful ability. Now, SDS drone deployment, this was a very powerful agenda in the startup format. This card does rotate. But the idea here is, at least in standard with a bigger card pool, you can run a deck that runs 3 SDS drone deployment and 3 Kimberlite Fields, and you can play a very, very aggressive rig destruction deck. You already have all these tools within Weyland. You have the Stavkas from Midnight Sun. These are 7 strength trashables, and eventually once it's down to 2 strength, you just sell this to the Kimberlite Field, and you're just destroying programs left and right. Again, more cards in this video we'll talk about. You have access to Trebuchet at 7 cost. You're going to bring down just about anything. You can bring down a liberated accounts, let alone the subroutines on this are disgusting. And of course, you have access to things like Trojan Horse in faction. So if you can play that credit war, you can take down other icebreakers. So you can have a lot of effects in your deck that very specifically target icebreakers, and then you can play a lot of good end the run ice and hopefully lock a runner out. Now, this is a different list. We are seeing ZF Protocol see wide play, just as the fact that it's a 3-2 agenda means you can always fast advance it, and that's super valuable and something that Weyland decks can do pretty consistently. But you're gonna have to play this one a bit differently. I don't know whether you're gonna play a seamless launch deck, but you are going to have to install Advance, or at least install Advanced and Remote servers, so this deck will look considerably different than some of the Weyland decks we see today, and that's pretty exciting. And this is the last puzzle piece, and Kimberlite Field requires rezzed cards, just like you want to do an op anyways, but so far to date, and I'm surprised, this is not a card in the standard format. This is a card from a long time ago, it's rotated out. But we don't have a Weyland card right now that allows you to res your stuff when you want to res them. Executive Bootcamp is super valuable, and I'm interested to see whether we're going to see something like this in Parhelion, because if you can go out of your way to res some of your bigger cards, you can set up a really nice Kimberlite. And that's an issue sometimes when you're playing op. When you have that OZF early, you realize, oh, there's nothing because they're not running. I can't trash my own stuff. Now, if you play assets, and you can trash assets to Kimberlite, you can kind of get around that. So it is pretty fascinating. Whether you want to play Divert Power, maybe that's your best option right now. Lastly, just as a recap, I think this thing's phenomenal. You have some ice in your deck anyways, things like Envelopment if you're playing op, that's going to get trashed anyways. You can kind of force the issue here. Score out a 4-2, have a pretty powerful effect, and ideally if you're playing op, this is not a real cost associated to it. It allows you to get the thing that you want as a reaction to what you've destroyed, and I think that's fascinating. This is a really powerful agenda if you want to fight for a rig shooter archetype and you want to build that, and it's not something we've seen in a long time in the standard format, let alone in startup as well, by SDS drone deployment. This is a very interesting agenda. Excited to see where these played. All right, now our second Weyland card today is a unique asset, and it's called Hostile Architecture. This 5-cost unique asset with the hostile subtype, you couldn't have it any other way, says the first time each turn, the runner trashes any of your installed cards, including this card itself, do 2 meat damage. When implemented at this sort of scale, these practices can keep away far more than a few unwanted citizens. 4 trash cost is pretty significant and it has 3 influence, so it's a card you can obviously splash, but you're going to have to consider it pretty heavily. It's worth noting the text of this is only active when it's res, like most assets, so to get this ability, you are going to have to pay 5 credits. One of the benefits of this card is that you don't have to res it until something is going to be threatened to be trashed, let alone itself, so you generally don't want to free res it until it's hopefully going to do something, or at least deter a trash. That's interesting. Now, this is an asset that protects not only itself, but protects all the other assets you have on the table. And it's pretty on the nose if you look at the name itself, but this reminds of a card that used to exist a long time ago back in the standard card pool, and that one is Hostile Infrastructure. While this one doesn't have the hostile subtype, this Jinteki asset, 5 to res, 5 to trash, caused 1 net damage whenever the runner trashed any corp card, including this thing. So the idea is if you had a hostile infrastructure up, it protected everything. If you trashed a hostile, it's 1 net damage. And while 1 net damage is less than 2 meat damage, it's not very often that a runner will let a hostile infrastructure up and go trash multiple things. So I think the 2 meat on the hostile architecture is actually pretty comparable, if not sometimes favorable, to the hostile infrastructure. Now, Hostile Infrastructure was a very powerful card. Back in the day, it was a key piece to this sort of a Jinteki asset-based horizontal archetype that spammed out a lot of assets. And a bunch of these assets would try and get this net damage kind of prison lock going on. The big thing here was Bioethics Association. This card, if you had all 3 of them on the table, you were doing 3 net damage to the runner each turn. And if the runner wanted to fight back and trash your assets, things that you recurred and protected with other Jinteki abilities, they would have to take the net damage of, again, the multiple hostile infrastructures. And the idea is that you could get these board states where no matter what the runner does, they're going to take net damage. And there's going to be hopefully some window within there where the runner ends their turn with low cards in hand. And then using the Jinteki tricks and traps, you were able to go for a flat line. Now that was a powerful archetype. And modernly, it doesn't exactly exist, but we did recently get a card in Midnight Sun just earlier this year, which was Bladderwort. And Bladderwort is a bit of a divisive card. I'm not honestly on Team Bladderwort, but this card has been performing. It gives you credit a turn, which is nice, but if you have 4 or fewer credits after this fires, you get to do a net damage. Now, these cards are also not unique, so it's hard to get 3 of these to fire in the same turn, but the idea is that you can put these in decks to build that sort of net damage asset thing. This card's been performing pretty well. I believe Singapore Nationals was recently won with a Near Earth Hub deck running 3 Bladderwort, but this is Fire RL's deck that they played at the Startup World Championships early this year. This deck came in first in Swiss, second overall, but the idea is 17 assets, Near Earth Hub, and 3 of them are Bladderworts. And this deck isn't inherently trying to kill the Netrunner, or kill the runner, with net damage. More so that these are cards that give you economy that the runner generally wants to deal with because this net damage is just negative tempo. Already in this Near Earth Hub deck, you have to check a lot of the cards on the table because there's a lot of card draw, and then just taking additional damage kind of forces you backwards. And now you have to spend more time drawing as well as doing all the other stuff you wanted to do on the table. So you see these tempo-based bladderwort decks. And that's sort of the idea of the sort of lists where hostile architecture can maybe show up in. It's an acid-based deck, whether you're playing bladderworts or not, but now if you also want to deal with their stuff, you're losing cards from hand, which maybe pushes you further behind. Now, when it comes to assets in Weyland, there are currently Weyland asset decks, and like everything we're going to be talking about today, Op is a big thing here. This is Bridgman's list that won Intercontinentals and did really well in the Continental season, and one of my favorite competitive decks this year, and it runs 22 assets. And it's trying to put a lot of stuff out there. It has a kill package if you step out of line and the credits get to one-sided with cards like Hard-Hitting News, but the idea here is that you have a lot of things that also do damage, a lot of assets that the runner has to trash because they do damage. The big thing here is urban renewal. And the idea is that if you do want to play some hostile architectures and protect your urban renewals, you're getting to that Bladderwortian, that sort of Jinteki sort of no-win state. It's bad no matter what you do. If you trash your urban renewals, you'll take 2 meat damage. If you let them fire, you're going to take 4 meat damage, and you can play up to 3 of these. So you can build these board states in which cards are going to come out of hand no matter what you do. And on its own, that's probably not exactly game winning, but I think a big thing here is about one of the cards we're going to talk about just next, which is a very potent Weyland card that capitalizes on the runner not having a full hand of cards. So on its own, that might not be game winning. I think in combination with the next card we're going to talk about, that's actually a board state you probably want to pursue pretty heavily. There's other things you can combine this with. I do think a big thing with the hostile architecture is you do want to ice it up. You can't really let this go down. You're paying 5 to res it. So if you protect this, it does protect your other assets. So I do think you want to spend a bit of investment just on at least one piece of ice on front of this thing. But there's some other things you can play that work really well with this card. Of course, Urban Renewal, other cards like SZF Protocol sometimes can put the runner in an awkward state where they trash things, go to low hand size, and an SZF Fast Advance can be lethal. That's something that happens in Bridgman's List every once in a while. I think Wake Up Call is a card that's seeing more and more play this year, and this thing's phenomenal. If the runner has trashed something on their last turn, you can play this. It's a reprisal, and it says that the runner has to either take 4 more meat damage or you get to trash a piece of hardware or a non-virtual resource. People are playing these in their decks to be able to sink the endurance. And if they've taken 2 meat damage and trashed something because of the hostile architecture, you can sink a boat. Home Run King connects. Other fun cards, Argus Crackdown. It's interesting. You need to ice stuff up, but it's more meat damage on top of other stuff you have to do. Not the biggest sell here, but CityWorks Project, similar. If the runner's trashing your stuff and doesn't have big hand size, maybe you can sneak out a CityWorks Project, maybe combine that with Punitive Counterstrike or Neurospike. And I think my favorite one by a mile is probably just Prysac. You can mash a bunch of Prysacs into the same server, and then they're kind of difficult to trash. At least the first Prysac a turn will be now 3 meat damage and a tag. And that, again, lines up so well with the next card we're going to talk about. And at 3 influence, this is a card you could consider splashing out of faction. I do think that, again, it's either 6 influence for 2 of these architectures or 6 influence for all 3 Bladderworts. So maybe you can play a Bladderwort Weyland deck that is trying to hurt you. And as we've seen some Bladderwort op decks do pretty well competitively this year. But on top of that, you could maybe consider putting these cards in Personal Evolution to build that sort of Jinteki net damage / meat damage deck that's spamming out the assets. You have to run the right stuff or the wrong stuff will eventually get to you. And NBN, License Acquisition, allows you to res a very expensive card for free. So you can get some of these on the table. It is unique, so you can only get 1 on the table, but that might be nice. With 17 influence for Near Earth Hub, you could probably put that whole package together. Now, there are some differences that are worth highlighting between hostile infrastructure and hostile architecture. It's hard for me to say the 2 words pretty quickly after one another. But the big difference with hostile infrastructure is hostile infrastructure did see play pretty consistently as a tech card in some asset-based decks, whether or not they cared about net damage as a win condition. The thing with hostile infrastructure, firstly, it protects every single card that the runner trashes. It's every single corp card, while specifically hostile architecture only protects installed cards. That is a pretty reasonable downside. While obviously if you're playing an acid-based deck, the stuff on the table you do want to protect, there's a big difference with hostile infrastructure. If you run central servers, you run R&D and you trash an asset, you're not going to take any meat damage. Let alone with infrastructure, you could protect things like snares and central servers, and that's kind of nice. 4 net damage if they want to trash this after it fires. That's wild. Other things is things like Stargate won't fire off the architecture, so you do have to worry about that. There's definitely some unique weaknesses as opposed to infrastructure, which kind of covered all your bases. On top of that, infrastructure saw a lot of play as a singleton tech card in a lot of the acid decks based on the way that it interacts with Apocalypse. A lot of times corporations would not mind so much when the runner has run all 3 central servers, which in acid decks were largely underprotected, and then they would ideally want to play Apocalypse to trash the entire board. Why trash all 15 of your assets when you can just run 3 central servers? But right before the 4th click was spent on the Apocalypse, the corporation would res a hostile infrastructure that was hidden somewhere in a remote server. And then at that point, the runner understood if they play the Apocalypse, sure, they'll wipe the board, but they'll also flatline themselves. So they didn't do that. Architecture doesn't really work like that. While it does do 2 meat damage, it's never going to really stop the Apocalypse unless you have very few cards in hand. In fact, that would be lethal. But that is a very big downside to something that used to be a pretty consistent tech card to deal with one of the weakest things that acid decks struggled against. Now, there are other ways for Weyland to kind of get over that issue. I think Overseer Matrix is beginning to see play as a card to deal with Apocalypse, let alone now it's another card that makes it harder and it protects some of your key pieces. The idea is that if you want to trash a card now, it might be a tag and 2 meat damage, and that kind of adds up. That's the idea here. With a Bladderwort deck, I think you can do something pretty mean. Now, it is tricky. This is a very expensive card, and sometimes you do like the expensive cards in these decks. Mind you, with Bladderwort, you want to be down on 4 or less credits, so having a big res that can suddenly jump you from 7 down to 2 can be a big surprise where the Bladderworts start firing. Now, a lot of the time these decks are a bit, they need to get going, and they can be destabilized if the runner's running aggressively and keeping down your assets. A lot of these decks have nothing besides assets to get economy. So to some extent, it can be feast or famine, but let me tell you, these Bladderwort decks are doing really well, and I think specifically when it comes to just doing some potentially insignificant amounts of meat damage are going to largely matter, specifically when we talk about the next card. All right, and that next card, that would be End of the Line. This is a new Weyland operation. It costs 3 to play. It's a Black Ops subtype, Call of Duty. As an additional cost to play this operation, remove a tag, and it simply says do 4 meat damage. The flavor text says, under northern skies, Sundog had lived all his life, and under them he would die. It's 4 influence, which is a fair bit of influence. And real quickly on that art, actually, I really like the art on this one. And this is something that we've actually seen before if you paid attention to some of the lore articles. I believe this is a short story that came out. Anzuki posted this, or wrote this. This was posted as of last year in September. And this is a short story that talks about Sundog, a character who is in the Arctic trying to break into what I believe is a high security Weyland base of some sort. The story is actually pretty great. You do see highlighted some of the cards that came out in Midnight Sun. Things like Light the Fire and Revolver are specifically called out. But at the end of this, right before Sundog is making the very big successful run, somebody kind of sneaks up on him and just guns him down. And he dies as depicted here out in the cold Arctic, where he has lived all his life. Now, I don't have 100% confirmation about this, so I might be not exactly accurate, but I've asked around, and it looks like Sundog might be the first ever Netrunner character who is, in some way, Canadian. And that's actually quite exciting for me. Now, unfortunately, it looks like he's pretty short-lived, and that's a bit of a bummer, but I'm hoping that there's more narrative to the Sundog story because he was too young. Now, this card, like some of the other cards we saw today, are kind of reimaginings of some of the classic cards from Netrunner. And there's no Netrunner card that might be more classic than what this card looks like, and that is Scorched Earth. Scorched Earth, all the way back from the core set in 2012, the original FFG core set, is basically the same card, barring one sentence. Scorched Earth, you could only play if the runner's tagged, while End of the Line, you have to remove a tag. Now, Scorched Earth was a menace. This was the biggest and best and largely only thing that Weyland decks could do back in the day. All the way back to the 2012, I believe, the World Championship. The first World Championship, which was only the FFG original core set, Weyland wins. And that's because they had access to one of the very few alternate win conditions in the game. The idea with Scorched Earth is if the runner has a single tag and you have 2 clicks, you can play Scorched Earth into Scorched Earth, which does 8 meat damage, which will just about flatline every single runner. And back in the day, you had access to cards like Sea Source. Modernly, Public Trail is the version of this. And Sea Source just set a trace if the runners made a run last turn, and if you had more money as the corporation, the runner got a tag. Nothing to it, really. And you had Weyland Consortium building a better world, gave you more credits for playing operations, so you got big money, you played Sea Source, Scorch, Scorch. Sea Source, Scorch, Scorch was the classic Weyland win condition, and it was kind of the best thing they could do for a really long time. Now, the first data pack that ever came out, very importantly, came with the neutral hardware Plastic Carapace. And Plastic Carapace saw a play as a 1-of, if not sometimes a 2-of, in just about every runner deck competitively for a really long time, just so that everyone had a way to not die to single Sea Source Scorch. And that obviously changed the value of this combo, but for such a long time in Netrunner's history, Sea Scorch was kind of a big thing you had to worry about. And this is, in almost every way, Scorched Earth back again. But obviously that one sentence is so important. This card says as an additional cost to play it, you have to remove a tag, which means if you want to do that Sea Scorch Scorch combo, you're going to need 2 tags. So you need to do something like Sea Source Scorch, which is obviously 4 clicks and very quite difficult. So we're going to see how this compares to some of the other meat damage we have modernly in the format, because you are going to have to work a bit harder to get this to land. And speaking about the meat damage in the format, technically, there was sort of 2 meat damage operations based off of tags in the standard format. I would say 2, it's not accurate. High profile target used to be the second option, and this scaled with the amount of tags that the runner had, but high profile target was just very recently banned on the release of Midnight Sun just a couple months ago. Large part because of mutually assured destruction, but this card doesn't exist anymore. And this is one of the best ways that Weyland could deliver a lot of meat damage. So right now we only have one option attached to tags really, and that's Boom. And Boom is a double, so it takes 2 clicks and it does 7 meat damage. So as a double and for 4 credits, you get a bit of a premium in some ways, but it's very comparable to having 2 tags and playing 2 end of the lines. Scorch, or end of the line is very comparable to a Boom. Now, Boom obviously is a single card, so you don't need to hold 2 of these combo cards in hand, but Boom also is a trashable card. It has a trash cost at the bottom. That's something that is kind of rare in operations, but it's a card that can get trashed from hand and can be pressured. You'll see a lot of runners when they're very tagged realize I just have to run HQ and hope I trash the Boom. So our question today is, if you're playing a Weyland deck that cares about tags, which kill combo should you play? Should you just be playing multiple copies of Boom? Should you be playing End of the Line? Or should you be playing some combination of both? And I think the biggest difference here with End of the Line is that End of the Line is a functional card if the runner only has a single tag. And giving the runner a single tag in a lot of board states can be a lot easier than giving the runner 2 or more tags. Not always, but sometimes. And I think that's a big difference that we need to highlight with End of the Line. How consistently can we make this lethal on a single tag? So let's look at the options. Firstly, you have to give the runner a single tag, and there's more ways to do that than giving multiple tags. I think Public Trail, again, our modern version of Sea Source, is actually really important. The idea is that the runner has less than 3 cards or less than 4 cards in hand, and then they have less than 8 credits. You can just do Public Trail into End of the Line, and that will end the game. So there are a lot of board states now where runners are going to have to consider their credits because Public Trail might be seeing more play as a very important card that can deliver a single tag with minimal interaction. Other cards I think are amazing is Snare. Yeah, Snare used to be a pretty common card in some of the Weyland Rush kill decks as something that you just left in central servers. And if the runner runs into this last click, if they're not expecting it, not only are they going to take a tag, but they're going to take 3 net damage, which means they're in a very, very difficult place if you have a single end of the line. Again, that could be the end of the game. Other cards like Prisec are super important. If you get 2 of these in a remote server, it's really hard for the runner to clear 2 tags, let alone take 2 meat damage and survive an end of the line, or even just fun stuff like Ping. If you res it at the right or the wrong time with things like border control, maybe you keep this unresed for a bit, they can end their turn with a single tag, and that can be pretty meaningful. Of course, Drago Ivanov is alive and well, and while you can make Drago into a 2-tag play over a couple turns, you can also install Advanced Drago, and then maybe if they ever go to low cards in hand, you can do Drago into end of the line. And then finally, we also have CU, which is a card that sees almost no play compared to Drago, who's a bit easier to fire consistently, but is another option if you want to get that clickless tag at the start of the turn. Now, getting a single tag, it does seem like it's possible, but how often is 4 meat damage going to be lethal? Firstly, we did just talk about Hostile Architecture, and that's a sort of deck that can, with enough assets on the table, maybe some bladder words, make these consistent windows in which the runner has fewer than 8 credits, so you can land a Public Trail, but also has fewer than 4 cards in hand, so you can get that lethal. I think that's super, super important. Other things you can work with, firstly, if runners are just having low hand size because they're taking on a lot of core damage, sign yourself up. Other things like Urban Renewal can build you that window, either on the turn that Urban fires or the turn before or the turn after. I think there are some instances where you can maybe lower the hand size from the runner and then the Urban Renewal gets them on the way out. Cards like Pharmacarry do see play in Weyland decks, and sometimes runners just go through this because taking 2 net damage is actually not very impactful. And now there is a backup plan where having low cards in hand and ending your turn on low credits can potentially be lethal. Builder Nations. You can play it if you want. I really don't like this ID, but it's another thing that loosens up the runners to be able to get end the line kill. And I think maybe this is the most fun one is AZF Protocol. If you install advance this and leave it on the table, there's a chance the next turn you can advance, score this thing and do 2 meat damage, maybe play a public trail or give a tag somehow, and then end the runner with a single end the line. And I love that. So I do think that a single tag kill is very possible with end the line as long as you have a deck that can support that with additional damage and additional tags through some other means. It might be difficult, but I do think there's a lot of board states where you can manufacture that, whether with hostile architecture or maybe just enough snares. But of course, you can also play this card kind of like Boom. You can play it as a card where you want to play 2 in a turn and hope the runner has more than 1 tag. And there's so many ways to give the runner more than 1 tag. In fact, it actually might be easier in a lot of ways to give the runner multiple tags. Of course, if you're playing standard, you're probably pretty aware of hard-hitting news. This is a terminal, so it ends your turn, so you're not going to be able to dole out the punishment right after the hard-hitting news. But if you ever have more money than the runner, you can give them 4 tags, and it can be very difficult for the runner to clear. They need to clear at least 3 of those tags in most cases. This is usually paired well with economic warfare, which can drop the runner's credits lower than what they think they have, and then suddenly they realize, I only have 1 credit. I can barely clear 2 tags, let alone 3. And one of the new cards is Mutually Assured Destruction. And this is so exciting that we have a card that pairs really well with this. The idea is that if you wipe just 6 cards from the table, 6 rezzed cards, mind you, you can give the runner 6 tags, which means even if they spend every single click clearing a tag, they're still going to have 2 tags left. And that can be enough to set up a next turn, end of the line, end of the line. Now, obviously, it has to be said that there's only 1 card right now in the standard format, not in startup, in the standard format that allows runners to clear massive amounts of tags at a huge rate. That's Misdirection. And for 2 influence, this card largely only shows up in Shaper decks because it's mostly important in decks that can pull this card when and if they need it from their decks using things like self-modifying code. So if you're playing against a Shaper, it is hard often to rely on the hard-hitting news or to rely on the Mutually Assured Destruction, but at least against Anarchs and Criminals, if you can give them 6 tags, they generally are going to keep at least 6 tags. Of course, this card specifically cares about 2 tags, and there's a lot of options to give 2 tags. I don't think any of these are very compelling because these work equally as well with Boom, but no one's really playing them, so what's the difference? So Amaze Amusement can make agendas into 2 tags if they steal them, and they have to steal them. Force Connection, if you want to do a big old trace, that's 2 tags. That's exactly what you need. And of course, things like Threat Assessment are kind of fun. It's another reprisal card that says either 2 tags, which can be lethal again, or return a card from installed to the top of the stack, if I'm not mistaken, which that can be an endurance, so it's hard to make that choice. And of course, Drago. It's always Drago. He's always there. But the idea is that you can double advance a Drago, next turn double advance Drago, and then just set up in a couple turns where you Drago, and then end the line, end the line. That works quite well. Now the big question here is if you're doing multiple tags, would you play end the line or would you rather just play Boom? And I don't have a straight answer for you here. I think what I'm most excited about end of the line is the single tag interactions, that you can build board states where a single tag, it can be lethal. But I think a lot of times playing Boom in your deck, while it is a trashable card, and mind you, Archive Memories was just recently banned, so bringing back those booms is a lot more difficult. I think if you're going for a big tag archetype, it might be easier just to have a single boom in hand as punishment, as opposed to hoping that you draw into both of your maybe 2 or 3 copies of end the line. So we'll see how that goes. Now, I do think one of the biggest things about End the Line that does make it favorable compared to Boom is that the way it interacts with some of the cards that are just seeing constant play in the standard format. A lot of Boom decks kind of fell out of style. And one of the big reasons is Stone Chip Chart Room is a very, very common card in almost all decks, specifically Shaper, but it's seeing play outside of it. The idea is that if the runner sees your game plan and sees that you can do 7 meat damage with a Boom, a lot of runners will keep 5 cards in hand and install the Stone Chip Chart Room. And then once they have 2 tags and it's your turn and you can't boom them, they'll crack the Stone Chip and they'll drop to 7. At that point, the Boom isn't lethal. It's impossible, just about to double boom someone in a turn. So just the existence of Stone Chip Chart Room kind of on the side kind of pushed out Boom decks. And that's a really big difference. If you can give 2 tags and play 2 end of the lines, you're doing 8 damage, which will be lethal, but through 1 Stone Chip Chart Room. They're going to need 2 Stone Chip Chart Rooms, or Stone Chip Chart Room and Lat Draw, I guess. Another really important interaction and distinction is the way that this card interacts with Steelskin Scarring. Steelskin Scarring is a reimagining of an older FFG card called I've Had Worse. And I've Had Worse functions kind of similarly. If this was trashed from your hand through meat damage, you would end up drawing 3 cards. Steelskin Scarring draws 2. Which means if you had 5 cards in hand as a runner and you had 1 I've Had Worse in here, if the corporation hit you with a Scorched Earth back in the day, you'd lose 4 cards. And if they hit the Steelskin Scarring, you would draw 4 more and you'd be backed up to 4 cards in hand. The idea is that you could actually survive 80% of the time a Scorched Earth combo. And that just doesn't work that way with steel skin scarring. If you have a single steel skin scarring in hand, double end of the line always flatlines you. And that's huge. Back in the day, it was actually really hard to rely on Scorched Earth combos against Anarchs just because I've had worse, and steel skin scarring now is such a ubiquitous good card. You will need 2 steel skin scarrings in hand to survive that, and even that is not 100% of the time because the first end of the line has to hit both of them. I'm not sure what the numbers on that are, but it's probably okay. I do think it's also important to understand that there are more cards like Deep Dive that are seeing a lot of play, which are cards that runners will keep in hand. I think Counter Surveillance is another version of this, where sometimes just doing incidental damage, just doing like tempo damage, just doing 4 meat damage that doesn't flatline the runner, if it knocks out both of their Deep Dives from hand, that can be worth it. Sometimes it's actually worth doing Disruption more than it is doing a flatline. So some players do keep that in mind, and you need to make sure you're calling that correctly. Now, of course, we did talk about Drago a fair bit so far today, but it is worth keeping in mind that because there are so many, and specifically in Standard, there are so many tag-based archetypes that are doing quite well on the competitive field, that a lot of runner decks are running some amount of tag prevention or tag avoidance in their decks. No free lunch for 1 influence, 0 cost is a pretty common card across a lot of archetypes. So if you're playing a deck that relies on tagging the runner and then hitting them with end of the line, you might struggle a bit because no free lunch is very common, as is things like Citadel Sanctuary. So that's something you're gonna have to keep in mind. Maybe you want to play extra tagging cards so that the no free lunches get popped preemptively, and then you can follow that up later with damage. But I do think one thing you need to keep in mind, and maybe this is a bit of negativity on my side, Salvage Memories was a very interesting set of Netrunner cards that was dropped at the end of 2020. You see, this was basically the off-season of competitive Netrunner, and it was kind of between releases. So the folks at Null Signal released this set of 18 cards, which were cards that have rotated out of Netrunner. This was kind of like an all-star set. It included a lot of very powerful cards so that the JNet lobbies were spicy for the next couple of months before new stuff came out. You recognize things here like Hostile Infrastructure, as we just talked about, but of course, very importantly, Scorched Earth. And unfortunately, when this set came out of all the exciting cards here, Scorched Earth saw almost no play. The new re-release of Scorched Earth had not a very significant impact on the competitive meta. Now, I do think that's to some extent because cards like High Profile Target were also still available. You could still play HPT, and not that HPT is technically better all the time than Scorched Earth, but that does color things a fair bit. But I'm just saying this as a warning tale. The idea of trying to get 2 tags and then land 2 of these cards in hand is actually probably a fair bit more difficult than just holding a single boom in hand. So where I am excited about end of the line, it's mostly the way that I'm excited about it with a single tag punishment. When it comes to double tag punishment, it actually might be harder to hold all these cards in your hand, and a boom might just do it. But it's not all doom and gloom. I'm actually really excited about end of the line. But the biggest reason why I'm excited about end of the line is because of startup format. Oh, this is huge. Startup format has had an issue where a lot of times corp decks are struggling to find alternate win conditions. And currently, if the runner takes a lot of tags in the startup format, there's only one single card that punishes a lot of tags, and that's Psychographics. It's been a while now. I think a lot of people, myself included, have wanted additional tag punishment that is actually quite lethal and quite game ending in the startup format. A Retribution kind of is just a very slow death. But now you can play that tag archetype. Whether you want to spend 8 influence in Reality Plus to get that meat damage, you can do it. But let me tell you, now in the startup format, you do have some real teeth when it comes to tags. And that's my favorite part about this. I don't know if it's going to have a huge impact compared to Boom in Standard, but in startup, this is a really, really huge inclusion. And we'll see if we can get that single tag, single 4 meat damage kill. All right, now we only have one more new Weyland card to talk about from Parhelion, and I saved the best for last, because this is the card that I'm the most excited from anything I've seen to date from Parhelion, and that is ZATO City Grid. This 3-cost upgrade, it's a region. You can only put it in a remote server, and of course regions, you limit 1 region per server. It says each piece of ice protecting the server gains this ability. When the runner encounters this ice, choose 1 subroutine on it. You may trash this ice to resolve that subroutine. Flavor text says getting in is hard, getting out requires a death certificate, and it's 3 to trash. Again, another whopping 4 influence. This thing is so wild. It's so powerful and very, very exciting for court players. But really quickly, let's talk a bit about the flavor. So ZATO City Grid isn't a specific place, but it is an idea. These are things that do exist. And these are largely what are called closed cities or secret cities. These are towns where settlements where travel or residency restrictions are also applied to specific authorization is required to visit or remain overnight. Basically, it is a town, an area that is very highly quarantined, and there's a lot of practices to make sure only certain people are getting in this. Whether they're research stations or secret military bases, these do actively exist. In fact, the name comes from the Russian term. There were many closed cities in the Soviet Union from the mid-1940s until it was dissolved in 1991, and a number of them still exist to date. In modern Russia, such places are officially known as closed administrative territorial formations. Now, apologies, I don't speak Russian, but that comes out to something like Zakrytia administrativno-territorialne obrazovania. Close enough. And that is the acronym of ZATO for short. Those are from the, I guess, the Cyrillic alphabet. And that's what this is. This is a closed city. You see this image here of a queue of cars going into a checkpoint. This is actually from a real closed city in Russia right now. This is called Seversk. And Seversk is fascinating. It's pretty outdated census report, but there's about 110,000 people there 20 years ago. And this city is built around a Siberian chemical combine, founded in 1954, comprising of several nuclear reactors and chemical plants for separation, enrichment, and reprocessing of uranium and plutonium. This city still exists, and this city, as of till 1992, just didn't exist on maps until Boris Yeltsin allowed that. And it was just called, it was referred to as Tomsk 7, which from my understanding just means it's simply a postal code, which implies that this place is located close to the city of Tomsk. So you couldn't go there. You didn't know where it was unless you knew where it was, and only certain people were allowed in there. And those are generally people who work on site. And that's the idea with this card. This is a very heavily locked down location. What's going on here? We don't know. Is it to do with the Kimberlite mining? Probably. And I'm really excited to the story behind this thing. But also mechanically, this card is absolutely fascinating. I think my favorite part of it is that this kind of matches with the design ethos we saw a bit with Revolver and Midnight Sun. The idea is that if your ice isn't working, why don't you just try throwing it at the runner? And that's what we're going to do here. In short, what this card says is that whenever the runner encounters an ice on this server, while a lot of times runners will have breakers or endurance, boomerang, botchless, you know how it is. Instead of allowing them to break the ice, you just say, okay, I'm going to pick a subroutine, I'm going to chuck the ice out, and that subroutine resolves. And resolve is a really important word. That doesn't mean that that subroutine is going to fire and they can break it. It just means it fires. And that is incredibly important. It's incredibly powerful. The closest card we've seen to this was Marcus Batty. Marcus Batty was an upgrade that was a one-time Psy game. Most corporations won that 2 out of 3 times, we'll say, just to fire a single subroutine on an ice on a server. A lot of times people used Marcus Batty just to end the run, and they relied on this as another pseudo like Nisei Mark II end the run condition. And I think it's much easier for us to play, specifically in Weyland, ZATO City Grid, and get some consistency and reliability and let it fire multiple times, let alone in a turn, but over multiple turns. The idea here is we can make any ice a border control. Border control is massive. This is one of the most powerful cards. It's 4 costs for this barrier that just ends the run. It does give you some credits too. But the big idea here is that at any instant paid ability window during a run on the server, you can trash border control to end the run. The idea is that if this is on the outermost part of the server, the runner can run through the border control, get through all the ice behind it, and then you can trash this thing to end the run. And that's obviously a very powerful effect. Now you can take any single barrier on that server and have that exact same effect. Now it is a bit more nuanced. It's important to understand that the runner doesn't actually encounter the ice, or more accurately, they don't have to break the ice that's being trashed, because you have to trash the ice right when they encounter it. They're never going to have to break it. It also means that you have to border control them, pseudo ZATO border control them, at the point that they hit the ice that has the end the run that you want to trash. So if you have your end the run barrier on the outermost of the server, it's not like they go through the full server breaking every single piece of ice and then you trash the first barrier. So you're generally going to want your end the run stuff all the way in most of the servers, so they have to go through the whole server just to get the end the run down the line. And that's not too bad. There's also, of course, another card that falls into the same camp as most of the cards we're talking about today, which requires you to trash things. So on its own, it's actually quite a playable card in just about any faction, but in op specifically, it's immensely powerful. The idea is that you can go ahead and trash like your Whoredom, a 4-cost code gate to end the run, and then you can go and see the board state and realize, okay, well, that ended the run, but now they don't have a barrier breaker, so I'm going to use op's ability to go get a 3-cost barrier breaker. You can also trash a Maskarovka later to just gain 2 credits, which, go Maskarovka. You'll largely do that just to end the run, but that's the idea, is that now all of these ice in your deck that have end the run abilities, something that shows up on most Weyland ice, now becomes these border control effects, and once per turn with op, you can go get another piece of ice to do that same effect over and over again. Another big thing is that you can actually trash a border control using its own ability to get the ZATO City Grid from your deck in op to set up further runs to be even more difficult. Of course, you're going to lose out on additional op value, but that's the idea, that you can make things quite difficult. But I think where I'm most excited about this card is actually just the cheap stuff. I do play Ice Wall as 1 or 2 of in my op list. It's the sort of card that eventually gets extracted away in the mid to late game when it's not very valuable. But now every single Ice Wall in your deck is just another border control attached to ZATO. And of course, if you're playing op, it's not only just a border control, but it's a border control that becomes a spin doctor. And that's amazing. The idea that you can take all the end the run ice and make it highly weaponized while you launch it at the runner's face just to force an end the run, and then you get op ability is so powerful and so flexible. Now, of course, there's other things you can do. You don't always have to end the run to get more ice. In op specifically, this allows such a bag of tricks that allows you to get op triggers on basically every turn, or at least once a turn when the runner's running a remote server. The idea is that if you trash your Hordem, sure, you can get a 3-cost ice, but you can also get a Bastiraboga, which means if they're ever running your remote server last click, this is another way for you to get fast advance tricks on the table. Similarly, maybe you need to pull out a Mavirus mid-run to deal with a Botulus further down the ice. That counts, that works. Or maybe you want to trash something like an Enigma on a run that this thing doesn't scale into the mid to late game, and you can either end the run or force the runner to lose a click and then pull out something like a Managarm Skunkworks. These are all lines that are pretty common to op, but the idea here is ZATO City Grid allows you access to these lines on so much more of the ice in your deck, as opposed to just like the border controls and the envelopments. We talked about this earlier today too, but we talked about rig destruction. And while end the run subroutines, firing those at the face of the runner is really important, you can also, of course, fire trash program subroutines. Sapper, another card that in the early to mid game can be quite scary, but in the late game is broken for free with a Begulter. So why not just launch it at them and trash the Begulter? Trebuchet has such a strong subroutine on it. Trash one installed runner card is the most flexible subroutine, so you can actually throw this at the runner, Trebuchet the Trebuchet, and end up sinking the endurance, which I think is a huge success story for most corporations playing it modernly, but that is absolutely amazing. Even things like Mouseless, like this card itself, you can trash this to do a single net damage, to get a tag, all this sort of things that can help you set up some of the end of the line kill combos, but the flexibility here is just absolutely fascinating, and I'm a huge fan. Oh, this is also worth noting. I did have to contact the Null Signal folks, and the rules team responded. Huge thanks to them. But if you have any card like Hordem or Mouseless that gets better when it's triple advanced, if you throw that thing to the ZATO City Grid, at the moment ZATO City Grid is firing, the ice is considered trashed. So it's no longer a 3 advanced ice. You'll just get the basic thing here. So you can't throw Mouseless to ever do 3 net damage. You can only throw it to do 1 net damage, no matter how advanced it is, which is a bit of a bummer. But yeah, I guess that is consistent with the rules. But speaking of 3 net damage, you can just throw Bathonymuses at them. Now, Bathonymus on its own is only a 1 strength sentry on a remote server. So while in the early game, it can be a very scary face check, in the late game, you're just saying you run the remote server, you're taking 3 net damage. Again, they can't break the subroutine, and that can set up all these sort of kill combos you want, let alone you could play this in Jinteki, and I think it'd be quite good. Anemone, similarly, you can get this res using some combo with either ZATO by trashing a 4-coster to get this res to suddenly do 2 net damage during the run, and then eventually throw this at them for another net damage. I do think you could probably splash these in Personal Evolution and just make sure that some of your ice is connecting. In HB, I mostly picked Z 2.0 because it says Trash 1 hardware on it, which I think is a subroutine we're all pretty excited about modernly, but you can launch this at face. I think there's sometimes launching a drafter at face could make a lot of sense, especially if you're recurring some of the ice that you just threw. I'm not sure if there's a ganked combo in there. There might be. But also Cold Site server works really well. If they have to spend multiple clicks to run this remote server over and over again, and mind you, this does work really well with the new HB identity that was just revealed today, but you have something going here. And then NBN2, again, it's a 4 influence card, but I think it's exciting enough to worth pursuing. So you have cards like Ping. You res this, you give them a tag, and then you throw it at them as a border control. And that is probably worth the influence. Vasilisa as well has an on encounter you could choose to fire, but you can give the runner a tag by throwing it at them. And maybe this makes sense for a deck that really cares about tags, makes tags hard to clear, but I think that's quite interesting as a way to give the runner tag in a more interactive way. It is worth noting, the text on this card is a bit interesting. It gives the ice specifically that you're throwing at them the ability to resolve a subroutine. It says the ice gains this text, which means the pretty enduring card Hunting Grounds that allows you to get around the when encountered on a piece of ice will work against a ZATO City Grid ice. However, that will only work once per turn. So if the server has 3 ice on it, the first one, they can dodge the when encounter and you don't have to trash the ice. And then the second ice to go through, you ZATO that one. So while Hunting Grounds isn't unique, it's actually really hard to out-tech a ZATO by playing enough Hunting Grounds. This is also worth saying is that Inside Job is a card that bypasses an ice you are encountering. And whenever you have 2 conditions that fire at the same time, so you have an Inside Job that wants to do something when you encounter, and you have a ZATO City Grid that wants to do something when you encounter, whoever's turn it is does their effects first. So if you Inside Job a ZATO City Grid, you actually do get around it, and you're not going to worry about the thing getting launched at your face. Still, the second ice down the line is going to be a problem, but that can be pretty important to understand. Now, of course, we have to mention this. This is a very powerful upgrade that can be a strong win condition for decks, whether it's Rig Shooter or just 12 border controls in the same deck. Pinhole threading is alive and well and is doing a lot right now in the modern meta. So while you may feel very, very secure with your ZATO City Grid remote server, you still have to protect your other servers because if a pinhole takes that thing down, yeah, you just have a bunch of ice walls on a remote server and it's not gonna look great. Top of that, Light the Fire. Again, you want to take core damage, you want to play as Essa. This card works pretty well and it blanks the ZATO City Grid and trashes it for free, which is quite nice. You have also access to things like Lucky Charm, one of the few ways you can prevent the ZATO City Grid and the run subroutine, and maybe you want to consider playing Always Have a Backup Plan. It's still quite difficult, but it's another way to cheat around things. And of course, if you're playing into Rig Shooter, and the corporation's just trashing all your stuff, you have access to Simulchip for recursion, you have Dummy Box and Shaper if you really want to protect your programs. This is a bit difficult, but if you have expensive programs, that's a nice way to keep them around. And if you're playing, anything else, you have other recursion options. Retrieval Run works with an Anarch, and you, of course, can just play more breakers. If you're worried about sappers getting launched at your face, an extra Bugalter probably is quite good. And that's ZATO City Grid, which of all the cards, if you're worried about it like endurance, this is a nice way to stop it in its tracks, let alone destroy it. But this is just such a flexible card, let alone an op that gives you more ability to fire the op ability and do the cool thing your deck does anyways, or just make sure your server is really well protected. Again, remote server only, so if that's the case, you still have to worry about central servers. It's sometimes easy as a corporation to overprotect the remote and then just lose to centrals. Maybe that's where your Kimberlite Field can trash some of those Stargates or the other multi-access. But those are the 4 cards we have today, and let me tell you, I'm so excited to see it. I think we've seen almost all the Weyland cards so far in the set. There might be 1 or 2 more, but we have the new set. Parhelion launches in about 2 weeks, which is really exciting. Right now, it is the spoiler season, so while we're dropping this video today, all through this week and a bit through next week, not only is Null Signal Games, check out their website, they're revealing and releasing more cards and more lore and story stuff, but a lot of people from around the Netrunner community have their own exclusive reveals. So keep your ear to the ground if you want to see some other very exciting stuff this week. Again, huge shout out to the folks at Null Signal for giving us these cards that we can reveal for the first time to y'all. Hopefully you enjoy them and you're as excited as we are. And I'd love to hear what you think you want to do with these cards, what you're scared of, what sort of decks you're going to be building first thing once this thing releases, again, in just about 2 weeks. We'll be around there. I'm excited to hear what you think. We'll be playing and jamming the new cards as soon as that comes out. We'll be doing live streams here on the channel and putting out some video content. So I'm very excited. 2 weeks is not a lot of time. Again, hopefully you enjoyed that video. Huge shout out to the spoiler season. Parhelion's looking pretty excited. Hey, Future Andre here. Thanks for watching the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I just wanted to take this time to insert a couple things that I forgot to add into the video. Firstly, we at no point talked about the flavor and the lore behind the term hostile architecture. That's quite a real term. It's an urban design strategy, the sort of thing that is used when building public spaces to kind of restrict behavior. You've definitely seen this. This can be as benign as the sort of metal braces they have, the grind blockers they're called, that are put on ledges in public spaces to stop people from skateboarding. But it goes all the way to the more kind of sinister looking stuff, like benches that have kind of like spikes in the middle, or just like metal spikes again in slopes or stoops, so that people can't loiter or homeless people can't sit or sleep there. Now, Weyland is doing that apparently in Siberia in the north to some extreme measures, but that's technically where that word comes from. It's actually quite fascinating. Secondly, we talked about, of course, in this video of End the Line, how exciting that is, and we're trying to see how possible it is to get a flat line with a single tag and 4 meat damage. And let me tell you, if you haven't seen the Null Signal Games HB identity spoiler on their website, check it out. And on top of that, just yesterday, Saka, our world champion from this year, did a stream revealing, I think it was 5 HB cards. And let me tell you, I think we're gonna get some pretty easy flat lines with End the Line. I'm actually way more excited about that card, even now. That's fantastic. And of course, these names here, these are a bunch of the folks that support the Métropole Grid, support me and the channel, allow me to put more time into this. So huge shout out to them. And of course, a huge shout out, huge thanks to all our Daily Cast patrons as well. Your contributions are immensely appreciated. And that's just about it. Parhelion's spoiler season, again, it's just around the corner. It's in 2 weeks, but it's been so exciting to see all the conversation, all these new cards, and they'll be here soon. Thanks for watching. Ciao.